First of all, thank you for inviting me to this serious exchange of ideas oriented towards reconstructing the world. Professor Y.S. Alone has already extensively dealt with key concepts uh, and vocabulary in Buddhist discourse, and broadly has engaged with the politics of knowledge that one confronts today. Hello? Yeah. So Professor Alone has already extensively dealt with politics of knowledge that one confronts today, or we have been confronting all along, and the need for both scholarly and epistemic and intervention, not epistemic, and scholarly intervention in the pedagogic practices taking place in the institutions of knowledge. So therefore, I would not get into the issues that he has already raised. Besides, I do not think myself to be capable of engaging in a Buddhist philosophical discourse that I feel I need to entrench myself in that discourse. Though I have rather seriously dealt with Dr. Ambedkar's Buddha and his Dhamma, and an attempt of reconstituting the world as he has envisaged it. Let me enter into this discussion since this is about how do we conceptualize the pedagogic practices of Buddhism today, but rooted in Ambedkarian framework and Ambedkarian perspective. That seems to be the broad idea around which we are discussing today. A few years ago, while I was responsible for activities of Phule Ambedkar Chair in the University of Mumbai, I had tried to articulate a research and teaching program on critical cultural studies. Incidentally, I think we could also seriously consider critical cultural studies as a kind of academic program for Buddhist University today also. Okay. This is my suggestion that we could articulate the critical cultural studies as one of the teaching programs, teaching and research programs in the broad idea of contemporary Buddhist pedagogy rooted in Navayana Buddhism. The reason that I had put prefix critical to cultural studies was that while there was a lot of activities taking place around cultural studies, massification of culture as a mass kind of a consumption, the cultural studies, specifically its American version, had led to integration of individuals into the structures of their own subjugation. Cultural study played an important role at the time to integrate individuals or broadly subjects into the systems of their own subjugation. Therefore, the idea critical to cultural studies had to be stressed. Such a critical cultural studies was already initiated by Stuart Hall in a cultural studies program at the Birmingham University, and he did extensive work uh, drawing on uh, experiences of race and racism, and broadly need for a critical cultural intervention by not being oblivion to material exploitative practices. So, kind of a cultural studies that Stuart Hall, was trying to articulate was sensitive to the the experiences of material exploitation, but looked at looked at culture as constituting material or cultural material as co-constituting categories, and therefore there is need for serious intervention in the domain of culture. That was the way Stuart Hall had articulated his work, rooted in Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies. But that then led me to back again to the whole idea about critical theory, because critical cultural studies have drawn largely on critical theory. And the critical theory, though the term comes in 1937, and eventually, and at the same time, the thinkers of Institute of Social Research were already engaged with the idea of consciousness as constitutive of social action, but in the context of emergence of fascist or masses, working masses, being in a way taken over by fascist myopic nationalism. Why is this happening? It needed a critical intervention. It needed an intervention. So that was of course, yes, so that was the, the central concern initially of, of members of Institute of Social Research, which began in 1923, as all of us know. The kind of a vocabulary that critical studies offered has relevance in understanding contemporary society. For example, the authoritarian personality. This is the conceptual baggage that you see relevant even today. The authoritarian personality, one-dimensional man, centrally administered society, and consumption culture industry. Now, these articulations were extremely important in, or they had emerged as as a conceptual baggage to address the question of quote unquote fascist and nationalist consciousness being making deep inroads in working classes, turning working class or turning the members of working class not as agents of historical transformation, taking humanity forward, but as agents of a myopic nationalism, as agents of as agents of of anti-human formation of an ideal society. Uh, as we know, yes, I mean, entire project of Hitler's nationalism was rooted in decimation of the other, the construction of other, and the decimation of and the erasing of the other, and constituting itself as legitimate and supreme claim to authority and power. Okay. Now this has contemporary relevance, uh, which and need not to be spoken so very clearly. While developing this uh, basic idea around critical cultural study, obviously, I had gone to critical theory and had found Max Horkheimer's early articulation in 1931 of the program for Institute of Social Research that he articulated in I think 24th January 1931. He gave this talk, new task before a new task for the new task before Institute of Social Research, new start, new task, and new beginning. That was the a title of the title of the address that he gave when he assumed the directorship of that center. Uh, so that and then another important work, obviously Max Horkheimer along with Theodor Adorno had already looked up to, had already conceptualized this category called culture industry. Okay. And very interestingly, had looked up to, had articulated the idea of dialectics of enlightenment. The dialectics of enlightenment was primarily a critique of instrumental modernity rooted in modernity itself. Okay. That by remaining within the ethos of modernity, it is possible for us to critique the instrumental reason. The instrumental reason, as we know, is rooted in how to do things better. But how to do things better does not necessarily mean it is how to perfect mechanisms better. But perfecting mechanisms better might lead to mass murders or programs of very effective administered, if effectively administered programs of mass destruction could also be realized as an effective as an effectively administered program. So therefore, critique of instrumental reason was central, but the critique of instrumental reason was rooted in ethos of modernity. You can't give away yes, I mean you can't give away the possibility and the facility of critique, which is core of modernity. Okay, which is core of modernity. So even critique of modernity could be based on ethos of modernity. Postmodernist thinking of the time, that is 80s and 80s and 80s, yes, I mean primarily, indeed talked about empowering subject, but also leads to this kind of a subjectivist nihilism that while subjects have to be is that through subjects you can question structures, you can question the So therefore, okay, in this sense, in fact, I mean, you can question modern structures, but it is impossible to reconstruct these structures, or the whole paradigm or the whole project of reconstructing structures is becomes irrelevant, as it might turn into another hegemonic and oppressive structure. So therefore, postmodernist thinking had laid itself into subjective nihilism, whereas critical theory was rooted in critique of oppressive, exploitative, enslaving formations as a precondition for reconstituting the world, for reconstructing the world, in order to make it more, yes, I mean, how do I say, more just, oriented towards freedom and therefore happiness. So justice, freedom, and happiness could be our pursuits in reconstituting the world. Okay. So by reconstituting the world, we could talk about justice, freedom, justice as conditions for bettering human social life. So yes, critical theory was rooted into this concern as critique is 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 necessary in order to reconstruct the world. This critique, yes, I mean, there's an interesting, yes, I mean, essay that Max Horkheimer wrote, and that essay was, "What is critical about critical theory?" Now, it says that while modernity itself or social sciences, rooted in sense of questioning, are already critical, but conventional positivistic social theory has laid itself into legitimation of existing world along with its operation and exploitation. So in a way, it while its quest for maintaining order, quest for articulating order, quest for maintaining order, and quest for monitoring, regulating, and therefore surveilling upon the order, the conventional positivist social theory leads itself into maintaining existing order. So maintaining existing order basically then leads to devoid of room for any kind of critique of oppressive and exploitative formations emerging from that order. Hence, this is critical about even critical theory. I thought that yes, I mean, would definitely have some kind of yes, I mean, that would definitely have substantial yes, I mean, ground for us to recover critical theory. So to re-engage with critical theory as one of our pedagogic concerns. Uh, yes, I mean, cursory readings of, as I have already said earlier, the conceptual baggage that it offers is, I mean, definitely has has an important role in understanding the contemporary world that we find ourselves in, including multi-layered and complex subjugation, vulnerabilities, and disenfranchisement that we seem to encounter today in, in our time. Uh, uh, I must very briefly also make mention to the key 4 points that Max Horkheimer had raised while addressing this new task before Institute of Social Research. Max Horkheimer had said three things, 3 to 4 things. He said that philosophy or social philosophy, social sciences, and humanities have to be synthesized as opposed to separation of social sciences from social philosophy. Now, as we know, Comtean social science, that is his articulation of positivism, was rooted in purging social sciences from philosophy. Reason was that while philosophers raised very important, fundamental questions, in order to, it does not allow us leads to a predictable form of answers which are necessary to establish order. Now, yes, as we know, yes, the question of order was extremely important again in the context of modernity, as modernity itself had transformed and made redundant the earlier forms of social philosophy. So it in a way articulated this kind of complete separation of social sciences from philosophy. Whereas Max Horkheimer was saying, in order to address the contemporary conditions of human existence, which are not merely quote unquote material, but they are social, material, cultural, and psychological, as rooted in personality too. Okay, we will have to once again resynthesize social philosophy, social sciences, and humanities as a kind of a kind of yes, a kind of co-impacting and it's, knowledge formations. This was the first point that he was trying to make. Another important point that he was trying to make in that lecture was that this dualism of subjective and objective will have to be questioned. Why? Because what is seen as objective is subjectively constituted, and what is seen as objective is subjectively experienced. So it is necessary for us to move beyond this sense of this dualism of subjective and objective. Okay, one need not now. Yes, this is again important because social sciences, Marxism included, of Marxian approach included of the time, was focusing on objective world and comprehension of objective world and the analysis of objective world which exists outside subjects, individuals, as the core concerns of social science. Of course, we have a phenomenological critique, we have an ethnomethodological critique that is trying to trying to once again assert the subjective and subjective meaning as constitutive of the world that seem to be taking place. But the large focus of social sciences was looking at the world for analysis as world that exists out there or outside subjects. Hence, this focus of social sciences or theory, or yes, informed largely by positivism or even by a subjectivist phenomenological approaches in social theory. While the positivistic social science, seen in structuralism, structural functionalism, and structuralism included, had primarily looked at yes, objective world as knowable, basically something which could be known. But at the same time, the critique of that approach, phenomenological sociologies, also were rooted in understanding the objective in subjective, because they were trying to understand the uh, invariance, because subjects are variant, isn't it? Yes, the moment you talk about subjective, you talk about variance. But phenomenological sociologists were rooted in understanding in understanding the invariance. You see, so therefore, I think they were trying to focus on how subjects constitute objective world. So both in this sense, the objectivist perspectives in social science, positivism, and its critique in phenomenological sociology, both in their own stance, were rooted in this kind of articulation of objective in nature. Uh, a phenomenological sociologist had this view. A phenomenological sociologist where I mean, as we know, in fact, an uh, uh, important conceptual practice that they had was intersubjectivity. That subjects subjectively are producing an intersubjective objective world through which they construct the idea of the social world. Okay, so but the point that I'm trying to make is this, that both positivistic social sciences as well as is phenomenological critique, both in their own varied way, were rooted in understanding, analyzing, and had focused on the world as existing both outside individuals and at the same time reconstitute and co-constituted by individuals as objective in nature. Now that, yes, I mean, okay, that was one condition. The another condition that critical theories had to engage with was this development of post-structuralism and postmodernism, which we had already, yes, and pointed out, had led to impossibility of reconstructing the world or any kind of engagement with the world, because it then leads to subjective nihilism. So, objectivist stance making individuals redundant to their own sociality, or subjectivist, yes, I mean, subjectivist approaches, making any subjective intervention redundant, was the challenge that critical theorists once again had to engage with in the contemporary times. I thought, therefore, critical theory offers this kind of possibility of, of critique of relations of power, multiple dimensions of relations of power, I'm saying, where individual is integrated into its own subjugation, um, uh, and structures of their own subjugation, exploitation, and oppression, and at the same time becomes an agent of reproducing those structures. You see, so you are integrated into the structures of your own exploitation and subjugation, but you also become an agent of reproducing those structures. So in a way, I mean, you as subject you become agent in reproducing your own subjection. Uh, 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 I thought, I mean, that was a very interesting insight that one gains from critical theory or re-articulation of critical theory in contemporary times in order to engage with multiple forms of slavery, enslavement that you confront today. Uh, uh, but while looking at this, I thought, is it not necessary for us to understand the Indian context of critical theory in order to address the questions of contemporary subjugation and exploitation? Is it necessary that we have to borrow necessarily from the the critical theory which was articulated in the context of Institute of Social Research? Yes, I mean, the way we are borrowing, I mean the entire concept of yes, social sciences have emerged primarily in the context of Western modernity. Though we use, yes, I mean, those conceptual that conceptual framework and theoretical understanding, theoretical frameworks to engage with our own contemporary social lives, even outside that specific geographical, cultural, and historical location of a Western society. we do draw from yes, I mean from these yes, I mean we have constructed the idea of social sciences, which historically was rooted in yes, I mean historical development, intellectual, social, material, historical development, and the challenges that it has posed today. Yes, I mean, but primarily rooted in Western society. But is it possible for us, or is it not necessary when we are trying to articulate the program for critical cultural studies, also to look at Indian context and Indian sources of critical social theory? Is it possible that we articulate Indian critical theory? While we were engaging with this, I thought, why not to look at Buddhism as articulated by Dr. Ambedkar in his Buddha and his Dhamma as primarily an attempt of both articulation and formation of Indian yes, critical theory. So you find a very strong, yes, I mean, very strong, uh, yes, I mean, a kind of an engaged attempt uh, in Buddhism or broadly in Buddhist discourse. I would, yeah, I mean, I would look at, yes, I mean, I would look at, yes, I mean, Ambedkarian articulation of Buddhism as indicating a Buddhist discourse, though it was articulated in 1956, but the way he conceptualizes the idea of Buddha's Dhamma, I guess I mean could be seen primarily as constitutive of Buddhist discourse in India, which in a way also has its part a critical bhakti that questions hierarchy, bhakti that yes, I mean that produce counter to hierarchical varnashrama dharma, bhakti as articulate as Buddhism as articulated by Gail Ombit as as rooted in yes, I mean critique of Brahmanism and caste, which is hierarchy, bhakti as critique of hierarchy or critique of given world or critique of stronghold of priestly class over some rest of society, and at the same time Jyotirao Phule's yes, I mean a critique of Gulamgiri, or Jyotirao Phule's critique of extremely exploitative and oppressive Brahminical yes, I mean religious, cultural, and material formation, leading to essentially fragmentary and exploitative society, to uh, later Ambedkarian yes, I mean, uh, movement and articulation as as again yes, I mean Gail Ombit has articulated as rooted in democratization of Indian society. So this is broadly a broad context of Buddhist discourse in India. Buddhist discourse in India does not have to be necessarily rooted, or Buddhist vision in India does not have to be necessarily rooted in the canons of Buddhism. Yes, I mean articulated during Buddha's time, or during in later philosophies. Yes, yes, I mean, developed in the Buddhist uh, in the Buddhist both in fact and scriptural okay as well as scholastic developments. But I mean, they could be seen basically in you could see a connecting thread of Buddhist discourse right from Buddha to critical bhakti. To of course, I mean, I have my doubts about bhakti because I mean, bhakti, the very discourse of bhakti is submission. Now that I find extremely right, extremely fearful because I mean the presupposition of bhakti is submission. Uh, Submission, if not to other individuals, but submission to the principle, which is, as you may believe, suprahuman in nature. Okay. So that yes, I mean I really found very, but maybe it's a critique of hierarchy and varnashrama dharma of 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 I think Brahmanism may be useful for us. So we will have to also engage critically with the bhakti, the critical bhakti traditions also. From there, yeah, I think we take to yes, I mean Dr. Ambedkar's late movement, basically as form of democratization, which is in a way an attempt of reconstructing the world, again rooted rooted in commitment to to principles of justice, freedom, and sociality or community or humanity based on commitment to these different principles. So idea of better life basically comes to this. So I was thinking that it is possible for us. Yes, I mean, of course, this is just an initial idea, but it is possible for us to reconstruct Buddhist discourse as primarily Indian context of critical theory. We could look up to yes, I mean Buddhist discourse as Indian critical theory, rooted in questioning all forms of oppression, all forms of exploitation, and all forms of subjugation and enslavement. Yes, I mean, yes, I mean, yes, I mean, I remember, yes, I mean, Buddha's concern, as Dr. Ambedkar is articulating, is where a reconstruction of social order into a righteous social order, where no man or woman becomes source of misery of another man or woman. Now that seemed to be the broad idea of a better world where one does not become source of another man's misery. We could add yes, I mean enslavement as well, gulamgiri as well as a part of misery. So this then leads me to yes, I mean, another idea that that I had drawn in the context of one of Bodhi's students' work on dukkha. Uh, I think, of course, yes, yes, I mean that work basically was trying to understand as to how dukkha, to which I would say dukkha is a context of misery and enslavement and feeling of being trapped into enslaving and miserable condition as uh, as the idea of dukkha. Okay, so this dukkha will I will have to be engaged with. In that work, I think the concern was to see how Buddhist uh, uh, Buddhist canon, scriptural canon, and Buddhist traditions have tried to engage with the concept of dukkha. I consider dukkha as the central concern of or engaging with dukkha as the central concern of Buddhism. And two or three aspects. I mean, I must speak about this category of dukkha. Uh, um, I said the idea of dukkha basically has to be seen in multi-layered and complex form of subjugation, enslavement, and disenfranchisement, but where you become an agent of these. You become an agent of your own subjugation. You become an agent of your own enslavement, and you become agent of your own powerlessness. You see, that has to be seen broadly as the idea of dukkha. Yes, I mean, Dr. Ambedkar is again and again warning us not to look at the idea of dukkha as rooted in individual, but idea of dukkha as rooted primarily in the notion of social. So dukkha in that sense is social, but how social is also making of, though it is not making of individuals, but it is a human making, the idea of social. So therefore, we have to engage with the world, because the world is also something that is created by us. See, so that needs, I think, some kind of an articulation. Uh, just, I mean, two or three things I would want to speak here. Uh, One second. Huh?
Till sir came,
Yes.
if anybody, any participant have any question,
Oh, no,
please
no, no,
write
no,
in.
no. No, I'm not finished.
Okay, yes, sir, yes, sir. No, come, please.
No, no, I'm not. No, I'm not finished. Okay. So the promise of Navayana for me is the promise of engaging with dukkha. Okay. Yes, I mean that could be, but I mean dukkha is the way, for example, certain contemporary discourses in Buddhism seem to articulate the idea of dukkha, and the way they seem to offer the path to engaging with dukkha is primarily rooted in individual as the context for experiencing dukkha, and also context for addressing and removal of dukkha. So it is individuals, those who experience dukkha, and it is individuals who can, yes, I mean, who can, in a way, yes, I mean, who can erase that dukkha, or who can eliminate that dukkha. But so it is primarily individual centric. I think, yes, I mean that perhaps, I mean, may not be the yes, I mean that perhaps may not be an adequate way of understanding the category dukkha. While understanding category dukkha, let me invoke this an important articulation as core of existentialism, as articulated by Sartre. Sartre was saying we are responsible for everyone and everything. As human beings, we have to be responsible for everyone and everything. In the sense, we have to own the ownership of dukkha. Of course, and Sartre does not speak about dukkha, but we have to own ownership of the world. We as human beings, of course, because there is nothing called supra-human or any other category which could be in a way is posited with the posited with the ordering of the world, or reordering of the world, or reconstruction of the world. We will, or responsible for the world. We as human beings are in a way responsible for everything and everyone that happens to human, something that happens to human world. So in this context, I mean, I thought, yes, I mean, and that he argues as the core of existentialism, and it is bad faith where human beings don't realize this responsibility that they have towards everyone and for everything. Now, from that perspective, I thought it is possible for us to understand the the idea of dukkha. Yes, I mean, or an engagement with dukkha. Dr. Ambedkar, yes, I mean, engages with the category called dukkha, which is misery and enslavement. Misery and enslavement, yes, I mean, basically, as as external to individuals, but making of human attempts of organizing and regulating the idea of social. So dukkha has primarily emerged. For example, Varna Ashrama Dharma is an attempt of organizing social in such a way that leads to dukkha. Okay, or considering the hierarchical form of social order as dukkha is an attempt of organizing social, in that context, dukkha is social in nature. Dukkha, therefore, while dukkha is external to human individuals, okay, that is, it is not individual those who have given rise to dukkha. Dukkha is primarily making of making of human beings, in the sense it is constituted by human attempts of reorganizing social, human attempts of organizing social. Okay, so hence dukkha is, though experienced by individuals, could be addressed and engaged with as an attempt of while individuals yes, I mean, experience dukkha, but the dukkha, that is misery and enslavement, is something that has emerged from that has emerged from ordering of social. Now this social is something that is not given, but that is collectively ordered by human beings. Okay, so that has to be understood as constituted as an attempt of conceptualizing social. But dukkha could also be eliminated by reconstituting the idea of social. Okay, so dukkha is experienced as social, but could also be addressed in terms of reconstruction of social. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is this, that while individuals experience dukkha, the dukkha that they experience, now here again there are yes, I mean, there are two categories. While while individuals experience dukkha, that is misery and enslavement, uh, and that individuals also become agents of reproducing dukkha, that is misery and enslavement. This dukkha is rooted in human efforts of ordering social, and at the same time could be seen as reordering social. So social is a context for experience of dukkha, but social is also context for reconstituting or engaging with dukkha. Someone had written that comment earlier, that we find ourselves trapped into the world, but the world that we find ourselves trapped into is also, in some sense, our making. Making in the sense it is human beings collectively have given rise to oppressive, exploitative, subjugating, and disenfranchising, yes, I mean, conditions of life, but it is human beings have to take responsibility of reorganizing and transforming that world. I think from that point of view, I thought, I mean, dukkha could be seen as I mean, social. The stress on individual quote unquote purity. Of course, I mean that quote in Dhammapada had become, yes, I mean, was cited again and again as core of humanity, as core of Buddhism, isn't it? By ourselves, evil is done. By ourselves, we endure pain. By ourselves, we become pure. So, and by ourselves, we tread the path, and by ourselves, we find the way. But that seemed to yes, I mean, that seemed to take away this sociality as context of dukkha. And I think it is necessary to bring back I mean, this social context of dukkha in order to address dukkha. But individuals are responsible in the sense, yes, individuals ought to develop a critical consciousness about their condition. An individual's attempt of dealing with dukkha in their life is primarily an attempt of becoming critically conscious. And in this sense, in fact, this is a reflexive action on part of and on part of subjects, that subjects have to reflexively, that is self critically, engaged with the category of dukkha, which is though rooted socially, but also though rooted socially, experienced okay, individually by individual subjects. But subjects also have to continuously and self-critically look at their own role in reproducing our structures of dukkha, reproducing, yes, I mean, structures and institutional practices of dukkha. So in this sense, individuals owe this kind of a self-reflexive, while dukkha is social, in the sense human efforts of constituting social, dukkha is also simultaneously have to be engaged with by individuals assuming this kind of a self-critical stance towards themselves, self-reflexive stance towards themselves, where they become critically aware about both the social conditions of dukkha, misery and enslavement that they have become part of, as well as their own their own role in reproducing those structures. So, in this sense, this is a kind of a self-criticality is I mean fundamental to engage with the dukkha constituted uh, in the category called social, but at the same time, this is also in a way assuming true subjective agency. So, meaningful subjective agency is possible through self reflexive stance towards socially constituted dukkha. I think, yes, of course, yes, I mean, one could, one needs a clear elaboration of this. I'm only sounding, I'm only flagging these ideas uh, right now, but I mean, they need to be, but they need to be, yes, they need to be elaborated upon, which we can take up a little later.